you came to previous lectures, I've asked you about plastics in your life, your relationship with food, how your daily life is linked to whale sharks, and underrepresented animals in your community. And tonight, my question for you is, and this will make more sense later, if you were an octopus, that's enough. If you were an octopus, what kind of IQ test would you design for a human being? Think real hard about that. Meditate on that as you listen to Wendy Williams. On that note, it's my pleasure to introduce Wendy Williams. She has been a science journalist and an author for more than 30 years. Her recently released book, Kraken, has received enthusiastic reviews from publications ranging from the Los Angeles Times to the Times of London, from New Scientist to Science News. I just finished the book on Sunday. It is a really fun read. I highly recommend you buy it tonight. Her previous book, Kate Wind, Money, Celebrity, Class, Politics, and the Battle for America's Energy Future, which she was actually featured on an episode of Jon Stewart. You can look that up on her blog. Was named one of the year's 10 best environmental books by The Book List. She is already at work on her next book, a biography of coral, which we will hopefully book her in a future lecture for, funded in part by the Ocean Foundation of Washington, D.C. So please join me in welcoming Wendy Williams.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a huge number of people, and I know you're not here to hear me, so you must be here to hear about the giant squid. Can an animal with its brains wrapped around its throat really be smart? It's an intriguing question, isn't it? Thousands of years ago, Aristotle pronounced the octopus stupid. That view prevailed throughout much of Western civilization until very recently. On an early June day, 2009, while the sad citizens of Boston were still wrapped in coats and huddled against the depressingly endless cold rain of that year, Wilson P. Menashe, in shirt sleeves, was in the back room of the New England Aquarium. He was standing in a rather large puddle of water, mulling over this and other questions of identity and intelligence, and ultimately the meaning of life. Menashe was 75. His companion in meditation, Truman, was about 2. Both were drawing on their individual life experiences, both having long since passed the halfway point of their individual life cycles, which in Truman's case would probably be just about 3 years. Menashe had decades earlier helped invent cubic zirconium. Having retired early, he had for the past 15 years volunteered 1 day a week at the aquarium, and acquiring in the process the status of a sort of staff member, albeit an unpaid one. His daughter had pushed him into it to keep him from hanging around the house after he retired, but no one had needed to make him keep coming back. He loved the place. Truman, on the other hand, had come here not of his own free will, if, that is, a giant Pacific octopus can be said to have free will, or any will at all, for that matter. Whether Truman loved the place or not, no one could say. He certainly seemed to love Wilson, though, or, to make some scientists more comfortable, we can say with certainty that the animal was undeniably drawn to the man. Wilson suspected with a degree of modesty that he and Truman had a special relationship, a thing going on. My feeling is that he'll let me do things with him that he might not allow others to do. Of course, I don't know that that's true. It's just my feeling, Wilson told me. Excuse me. As I walked through the widening puddle over to the pair to introduce myself, Truman and Wilson were quietly engaged in an intimate dance, a kind of pas de deux, a dance of 10 arms. Wilson's 2 arms gracefully clasped, as well as they could, whichever of Truman's fluid, boneless 8 arms decided to wind around Wilson's. Is decided the correct word here? Who knows? Scientists know so little about these creatures of the cold northern Pacific that we cannot say for sure. Thanks so much for everybody for coming to listen to me tonight. This is, I remember the first time that I ever came to the New England Aquarium, and I guess everybody here has visited the aquarium. The first time I came, I was a college student from the Midwest, and I was going to school in Vermont. I had a couple of friends who were from Boston, and they decided they needed to bring me down to Boston to get educated. They took me to see the Science Museum, they took me to see the Fine Arts Museum, and they took me to the aquarium. I have to be honest, although I love the Science Museum and go to the MFA often, I don't remember much about my first visits to those august institutions. But I do remember my first visit here. Who could possibly forget the penguins? They were amazing. And I remember the aquarium tank. I'd never seen such a thing. I walked so slowly and tranced up that ramp, trying to see as much as I could. It was just after the aquarium had opened and the place was packed. Now, of course, it's many decades after the aquarium has opened and the place is still packed. In fact, that first visit here, more than half a lifetime ago, is one reason why I wrote this book. Coming from the Midwest in those days, my closest experience to the ocean as a child was a frozen lobster tail dinner. Seeing the aquarium tank with so many different life forms, animals I'd never in my wildest Midwestern dreams imagined, made me curious. What were these things? What did they have to do with me? I was curious, but I was also somewhat disturbed. The animals in the great tank forced me to ask a few questions. What is life? Why are we here? What in the world is our role in the universe? And what are we supposed to be doing while we stride around the major mammals on planet Earth? My book, Kraken, The Curious, Exciting, and Slightly Disturbing Science of Squid, attempts not to answer these questions because I'm not capable of that, but to perhaps shed light on one tiny facet, on one single piece of the immense puzzle that is existence. To be honest with you, the animals in that tank, the first time I walked up that ramp, were a little bit frightening to me. I was shocked. The Saturday afternoon B-movie horror flicks that I saw in the Midwest about monsters in the sea did not help my attitude at all. I remember seeing as a 5-year-old, It Came from Beneath the Sea. Here's an early Hollywood conception of the behavior of the octopus. This was the movie where the 6-armed monster came up out of San Francisco Bay. It was supposed to be an octopus, I think, but it had 6 arms. Its slithering tentacles wound their way across the Embarcadero and grabbed unsuspecting women and children off the streets of the city and took them away to some deep-water netherworld. I was horrified. And so I confessed to a certain amount of trepidation when I stepped up to meet Wilson, Menashe, and Truman that first day that I began researching my book. I'll read you a little bit more about what happened. On this particular June day in Boston, Wilson Menashe didn't appear a bit fearful. The rhythmic embraces of the giant Pacific octopus seemed almost to soothe him. Wilson could have been playing quietly with his pet dog. The puddle he was standing in was getting wider by the minute. As it was only an inch deep, death by drowning did not seem imminent. On the other hand, who knew what this kind of intimacy could lead to? That was my way of thinking anyway. You have to keep playing with them, Wilson told me, casually peeling suckers off his neck and shoulder and throwing an arm gently back into the octopus tank. They get bored very easily. They just enjoy doing things. They'll work on a puzzle for a long time, and they do lots of other things just because they want to. Or they won't want to. Wilson, wearing his creative engineering hat, has devised all kinds of puzzle boxes for his various giant Pacific octopus clients. And he's found over the years that some of the animals will stick to the task of solving a problem, and some will just give up and go into a corner or hide behind a rock. Others will never be interested at all from the beginning. Only a few months before I met him, Truman had gained international fame for his persistence in trying to solve a complex puzzle box that had been made for him. And an aquarium visitor had photographed Truman's attempts, and that had been put into a video, and the video had flashed around the world in viral form. Truman was a star. But Kraken is about a lot more than just the creative smarts of the giant Pacific octopus. It's also about a whole group of animals known as the cephalopods. And it's about the many different scientists interested in studying all these different cephalopods. I'll read to you another adventure that took place out in Monterey Bay. For those of you who don't know, I was told this afternoon that Monterey Bay is the other aquarium. But for those of you who don't know, it's on this California coast in the center, and they're pretty nice people. Julie Stewart cradled her research subject in her arms. Her ponytail dripped salt water. The back straps of her luminescent yellow waterproof Grindons were twisted tightly to better fit the slight frame of her 5'3" body. She was covered in squid ink. The sun had long since set. It was mid-November 2009, about a month away from the winter solstice. The sea was a bit rough, the air a bit chilly. Julie was kneeling on the dive platform of an unnamed government research boat in Monterey Bay. She was outside the safety of the deck rails. Above her were all the stars in the universe. 2 miles below her was the bed of one of the world's most sublime kingdoms, the Monterey Submarine Canyon. You could have said she was ethereally poised between heaven and earth, but she'd have been taken down a notch if you looked around at water level. Monterey Bay is rimmed by all the inglorious mundanity of 21st century human existence. Nearby were the mansion lights of Pebble Beach, the golfer's mecca. A corporate jet flew overhead, preparing to land at the local airport. Off in the distance, the towering stack lights of the region's hulking electric plant glistened and beckoned nearly as powerfully as the stars overhead. Nevertheless, Monterey Bay is a wild place, filled with whales and sharks and shoals of fish, and forests of kelp and 20-pound sea slugs and 50-pound Humboldt squid and diaphanous 100-foot-long cynophores, jellyfish-like creatures that form nets with their poisonous tentacles and wait for prey to come their way. This cold, deep world throbs with energy. It's a saltwater Serengeti. My book, Kraken, began as an exploration into the biology of squid, but it quickly evolved into a biography, albeit a loose one, of cephalopods, of how they came to be in our oceans, of how they survived so many major extinctions, and of how they've helped us better understand our own human biology and our own human history of life on Earth. Curious, isn't it? And slightly disturbing. The truth about squid makes us rethink so many of our own human truths. To find out more, I visited labs, I spoke with scientists, I hitched a ride on an evening research cruise, I read books and magazine articles and scientific journals, and I tried to understand. One of the first things I realized was that I needed to look at all the cephalopods, squid, octopuses, cuttlefish, and even the probably just a pretty face Nautilus, because they are all close cousins. Cephalopods are soft-bodied animals and are a branch of a very, very old group, the mollusks, familiar to most of us as the clams we eat, either fried or mixed into pasta or made into chowder. Cephalopods are skeleton-free. Surprisingly to us vertebrates, cephalopods seem to have made out quite well in the ocean, even without the burden of bones. Cephalopods have a main body called a mantle in which the vital organs are contained. A cephalopod has a mouth and a beak, which it uses to tear apart prey. The beak is something like a bird's beak, only in some species it's so strong that materials scientists are studying its structure to learn how to make an object as strong and as sharp as steel, but without any metal. In other words, in the future, we all might be able to make knives that don't require mining the Earth's depths, all because of the squid. Cephalopods, of course, have many arms. How many arms depends on the species. Octopuses are called octo because they have 8 arms. Squid and cuttlefish are called usually deco because they usually have 10 appendages, 8 arms and 2 tentacles. These tentacles can sometimes flash out with such speed to grasp their prey that it's difficult for human eyes to follow the motion. This is why most people do not want to meet a giant squid face to face in the ocean. Then there's the beautiful but not overly bright Nautilus, an animal that lingers in the sea in its beautiful shell, rising and falling with the light of the sun. They have many, many arms, but most scientists think they may be short on actual ocean smarts. Some scientists think that evolution may have brought about an ever-decreasing number of arms, and that Nautilus-style animals came first. Then the group gradually dropped arms, and in turn, the arms that were left may have become more efficient. Cephalopods are called cephalopods because they seem to early humans to be little more than a head and foot pod. There didn't seem to be much to these animals, and as we know, Aristotle thought they were stupid. But now it turns out that there's a lot more to these animals than simply a head and foot. A lot of people have asked me over the last several months how I came to write a book about cephalopods, and to be honest with you, while I was writing it, I asked myself the same thing. How did I get stuck with this book? Here's the answer. For several decades before I wrote the book, I had known one particular fact that fascinated me. Although these animals are so different from us, we share essentially the same neuron, the same brain cell or nerve cell that makes it possible for us to walk and run, to read and think, to swim in the sea or lie on the beach. The first time I saw an actual live squid when I was a science journalism fellow at the Marine Biology Laboratory in Woods Hole, I was quite taken aback. The truth about the neuron was, well, quite shocking. What did that mean for me as a human being? Where did that put me as far as the ladder of life? Because in those days, most of us still thought of life as a march of evolution, from the lowest rungs to the highest rungs. And of course, we put us up at the top with the best and brightest of them all. When I first saw a squid, I was more than ready to go along with the public perception and definitely assign this squirming, squiggly little thing to one of life's lowest of the low rungs. And yet, here was this animal with the same neuron as me. So for a long time, I wanted to explore the mystery of the shared neuron further. And since I'm a writer, I do that by writing. But how in the world could you write a book about squid? Because it's my job as a popular science writer not only to write a book that explains science to the general public, but to try to write a book that people will actually want to read. It's not enough for you all to buy the book, you have to read it too. So I needed something that was going to be fun. I needed to lure people in with my tale of mystery and intrigue, and maybe even downright horror, to trick them into thinking about evolution and our place in the universe. You thought you were going to read about giant squid, but you turned out to read about us. How do you begin such a book? When I started the book, there were a slew of docudramas on the cable stations, Killer Squid, Glowing Cuttlefish, and a long list of B movies. It came from beneath the sea and all that sort of thing. So I started my research by watching terrible movies and by finding all the docudramas I could find on television. And it turns out that people for centuries have loved to be horrified by these animals. Take the French, for example. After Victor Hugo wrote Toilers of the Sea, in which a giant octopus ultimately dispatches with one of the bad guys by seizing him with 8 huge tentacles, Paris fashion was seriously impressed. Everything is octopusy, wrote one English-speaking letter writer. And indeed, for a while, Parisian women did go around with octopus tentacles hanging from their hats. A few of the popular documentaries I watched featured the lab of Stanford University's Bill Gilley. Gilly had been doing field work in Monterey Bay to try to understand more about a sudden invasion in U.S. Pacific coastal waters of a strange species of squid that nobody knew much about. This animal was called by some the red devil, by others the killer squid, by others the jumbo squid. Scientists called them Dissection gigas, or often as nicknamed just plain Dissection. The picture of that man that's holding that animal is 6 foot 5 inches tall. So you can see that's a big squid. Red devils were said to have arms covered with suckers, and the suckers were said to have teeth on them that were so sharp and so strong that they could lacerate human flesh with just one swipe. There's drama for you. So I decided to head out to Monterey Bay, where hundreds upon hundreds of these animals were said to have taken over coastal areas, laying waste to everything in their path. This was biblical. Who could resist? Of course, what I found out there was something somewhat different from the docudramas, but it was a whole lot more interesting. So Kraken is on one level the story of Julie Stewart, a woman in her late 20s who was studying these animals in the field for her PhD. Rocked by 3 and 4 foot waves, Julie held her animal close to her chest. At 28, she was chief scientist of this evening-long research cruise and was part of an informal international team of scientists stretched along the west coast of South and North America. They were all focused on learning more about the biology and behavior of this suddenly prolific, strange animal. The scientists had endless questions. Where had these guys come from? Where were they going? Why were they here in Monterey Bay in such great numbers? Had something changed in the Pacific that had suddenly opened up a niche for these opportunistic animals to exploit? Was it because the oceans were warmer? Was it because many of the sea's top predators, like whales and sharks, had disappeared? Was their explosion in numbers a symptom of some kind of extinction event that affected other kinds of animals but not cephalopods? Or was the species' sudden increase simply one example of the normal long-term ebb and flow of life in the oceans? Kraken is about a lot more than just horror vignettes in Julie's story. It tries to show the reader a wide span of science that we're undertaking that depends on species that thrive in the sea. So I visited a lot of places. One of the places I visited was a high school just north of here in Newburyport. I probably don't need to tell most of you that Newburyport is a very cool town, where local folk once thrived on fishing but have had to remake themselves in recent years because of our Atlantic fish stocks declining. I did a couple of things in Newburyport. I visited Plum Island, where a very famous squid landing had occurred in 1980. On a frigid winter morning in February 1980, 36-year-old Steve Atherton, a family friend of Rob Yeoman's, woke with mixed feelings about the northeaster raging outside his Newburyport cottage. The moisture was needed, but the bone-chilling wind blowing in off the North Atlantic would make for a nasty beach run. As Atherton drank his early morning brew, he briefly toyed with the idea of staying warm, but then habit took over. Plum Island, a 9-mile-long, 6,000-year-old barrier of sand and rock that protects the mainland from the open North Atlantic, remains mostly in its natural state. When Atherton ran over the sand that frigid, windy morning, he saw what he thought was a log washed in by the gale. But both the color and the shape were wrong. Finally, only a few yards away, Atherton understood. It was a squid, a huge squid, of a size unlike any that he'd ever seen. It seemed nearly dead, but his eyes were still clear. His 2 feeding tentacles were missing, and the thing was huge, almost beyond imagination. But mostly it was the eyes that he would remember forever. They were as large as dinner plates. They still seemed, even in that deathly state, to have an eerie ability to follow prey with an intense and unwavering focus. The rest of this section tells the saga of this particular fabled giant squid, which may be the world's most well-traveled squid. The poor thing made its way from Plum Island all the way down here to the New England Aquarium, where it turned out not to be very popular with the staff because of its aroma. There was some talk of the Plum Island squid being taken over to the Harvard Natural History Museum, but museum officials vetoed that idea. They didn't say why, but it could have been for the same reason. So Clyde Roper, a New Englander by birth who still retains just a charming bit of down east accent, put the squid into a coffin. He slid the coffin into a hearse and drove the animal down the Mass Pike and down I-95 all the way to the Smithsonian in Washington, where the squid rested for a time in great honor right beside Teddy Roosevelt's stuffed African elephant in the rotunda. But then, the ladies of the Smithsonian decided to hold their Christmas gala in the rotunda. The squid was banished. The smell did not go well with eggnog. So the squid moved into the Smithsonian basement, where it next made a bizarre cameo appearance in a Dan Brown book. I also visited in Newburyport a high school marine science laboratory. The teacher, Rob Yeomans, had flown one of Bill Gillies' jumbo squid, Dissection gigas, from California all the way across the continent to Newburyport. This was the heyday of Dissection docudramas, and Rob hoped to use the species' fame as a way to lure in the students. Boy, it sure did. Here's the scene in the dissection lab in that high school that afternoon. It wasn't until live worms, long and white and writhing, emerged from the carcass of the 2 years dead Dissection gigas that shrieks of joyful terror filled the Newburyport High School dissecting lab. "What's this?" one student asked commercial fisherman turned teacher Rob Yeomans. He was holding a white mass in his hands. It was about 6 months before Rob met me to go Dissection fishing on the West Coast, and he was helping his marine biology students dig into the innards of a carcass sent to him by Bill Gilly. I was up there too, watching along with several other adults. When Rob heard the shrills, he turned to look. Already the things had managed to spread. At about 3 inches in length, they looked like short tapeworms. The lab table was covered with these squirrely hopping things that seemed to be able to stand up on their tips and cavort along the metallic surface like weird animation creatures. One adult decided it was as though he'd been sitting in a bar and had one too many, and the bartender's cocktail straws started crawling toward you like inchworms and then stood up and danced right before your eyes. The unofficial consensus was that they were some kind of unidentified parasites that had stowed away in a squid and managed to survive 2 years in deep freeze. Then, like something from that B-movie horror flick, they reawakened on the other side of the American continent in this high school dissecting lab. This confirmed my own worst nightmares. Before starting to carve up the carcass, Rob had carefully instructed the kids to put on latex gloves. Most complied. One boy, though, declined. He wasn't worried. His dad was a scientist. He was experienced at this sort of thing. When the jumping started, he'd been holding a pile of the white things in his hands. Warmed by his palms, the mass came to life and began squirming. The boy's face turned ashen. He put the mess down, headed over to the faucet, picked up the soap, and began scrubbing. Minutes later, he was still scrubbing. Whatever the things were, he didn't want them burrowing into his skin, which in reality is exactly what they might have done if he'd held them long enough. And then I realized I forgot to tell you all what they were. These are packets of sperm, and they're called spermatophores. The male, yes, those are spermatophores, and the male puts them on the flesh of the female, and they burrow their way into the female flesh and wait until the time is precisely correct. You can read more about it in the book. Of course, I also returned to Woods Hole, where I had been the Science Writer Fellow. Here's what happened there. For more than a century, the summertime village of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, has been a world-renowned center of intellectual excitement, as well as a fashionable watering hole for the scientific elite. Some of the world's best biologists, including a liberal salting of Nobel Prize winners, have come to sit on the beach and play tennis, to work in the research facilities of the biological laboratory, to give and attend lectures, and to exchange ideas. The village's sidewalks overflow with scientists, students, and tourists, and there's rarely a place to park your car, even on Albatross Street. But in the winter, the village can be awfully forlorn. Water Street has a distinctly dowdy look, as though it's down on its luck. Slate gray skies hang heavy over the silent institutional buildings. The renowned science library, where you can hold in your hands journals from the mid-1800s, is almost deserted. If you walk down the main street on the wrong November day, you could easily think that this village is on the skids. But if you're there on the right November day, there's an intellectual Indian summer. That's when the neurosurgeons arrive, ready to bone up on the latest discoveries in their field. Among the many skills they learn is how to dissect a live axon from a decapitated squid. Or at least, they try to learn that skill. On the particular day I went to observe, it was chilly and wet. Sheets of rain flooded the street, and farther north in New England it was snowing. The first crew of confident neurosurgeons made their way, head down against the downpour, to the research building where so many Nobel scientists have worked, and where squid and so many other marine life forms have been studied for nearly a century. Course teacher Bruce Anderson, a neurosurgeon from Idaho, picked up an 8-inch squid, a common Lolligopalii, in one hand. He held a pair of scissors in the other. The animal's chromatophores were showing. It flushed a deep, rich red. Anderson held on to the squid body. The animal's 1 head, 8 arms, and 2 tentacles writhed. "We'll start with a gross dissection," he said. Then he snipped off the head. A deep, anguished groan came from the 30 mostly male surgery residents. "Neurosurgeons are surprisingly squeamish," Anderson told me later. "And it's all for the good of science," he coaxed them. "This is the guts and stuff," he said as he cleaned out the body. Next, he demonstrated how to lay out the squid's body, find the giant axon that allowed the animal to swim, and gently remove it. Anderson gave each student a squid and ordered the students to begin their own fine dissection, the removal of the squid axon from the animal's flesh. Properly handled, an axon can continue to function for hours after the animal is dead, even when completely removed from the specimen. The point of this exercise was to remove the axon without harming it. This turned out to be a lot more difficult than the neurosurgeons expected. Loligo's axon is large and easily visible, but it's also diaphanous, like a beautiful bridal veil or a thin sheet of water cascading over rocks. It's as delicate as gossamer and as easily destroyed as the filament spun by a small spider. Nick the axon cell membrane and you are toast. All the surgeons tried, all failed. Their axons died on the operating table. "You'll have to go talk to the families now," Anderson instructed. "Luckily, few squid have good lawyers." So ultimately, what does all this mean? One of our culture's most fascinating questions these days is there life in the universe out there? Is there intelligent life? Can we communicate? What do we mean by communication? What do we mean by intelligence? Out there in the universe, clues are increasingly tantalizing. We all know now, or most of us know, that we found a lot more water out there in the universe than we ever expected to find, and life somehow seems to have begun in the water. I doubt the answer to this mystery will come in my lifetime, but one thing that surprised me in my research is that many scientists think that studying life in the ocean is paramount to studying life forms in the universe. The more we learn about communicating and understanding the ocean, the more we'll know about how to communicate with aliens out there. And looking into the deep ocean, what life forms could be more alien than cephalopods? So I asked many of the scientists I interviewed if they thought cephalopods were intelligent. Only one answered no. The rest had apparently given this question a great deal of thought. The cephalopod brain is arranged in a truly unique manner. 3/5 of their neurons reside not in the central brain area, but in their arms and tentacles. This means that the arms and tentacles can do some pretty astonishing things. In many ways, they seem to act of their own accord. The vampire squid, which is really more a pretty wallflower than a dangerous monster, can bite off an arm tip when threatened by an enemy. Then, the arm swims away, flashing blue lights, luring the predator away from the squid's main body. Another squid to mate takes some sperm and an appendage, then severs the appendage from its main body. The appendage then swims over to the female and inserts the sperm. Sometimes arms can seem to be able to act independently from each other, and sometimes the halves of one body may act independently. There's a male cuttlefish that during courting can flash warning stay away colors and lights on one half of its body, but on the other half flash sweetheart I love you so much colors near to the female. This gives new meaning of the concept of divided personality. Clearly, learning to understand the intelligence of such species is going to be a challenging task. Currently, we haven't even reached square one on this issue. We don't know how to ask a meaningful test question. How would you find out whether a cephalopod is intelligent or not? I asked Dr. James Wood, a cephalopod scientist, and he turned the question back to me. So a couple of octopuses are hanging out in a bar. They're having a drink, and they're saying to each other, you know, it's a lonely life here on planet Earth. Being the smartest animal on the planet is just not very easy. It would be so nice if we could find some other species that might be able to at least communicate with us a little bit. Gosh, it's lonely down here. So the other octopus takes a sip and thinks, you know what? Let's test humans. They seem to show a little bit of promise in very few limited ways. So let's figure it out. Let's ask a question. Here's the question. How many colored patterns can your severed arm produce in 1 second? And there you have it. We humans find ourselves on the lowest of the low rungs of animal intelligence as far as the cephalopods are concerned. Thank you all so much for coming and being interested in my talk. I'd like to make a few thank yous. Thanks to Wilson P. Menashe and all the volunteers who have given so much of their time. Renewing the Aquarium. And thanks to the staff and supporters for inviting me here. And a very special thanks to Deb Kramer, who is a wonderful author and ocean advocate and a really terrific friend. She was going to come. Did she make it tonight? Is she here?
Don't think she did.
Oh, she didn't make it. Well, thanks anyway, Deborah. And thank you all. Do you have questions? Yeah.
I have a question. When you were investigating their intelligence, did you at all research the Mimic Octopus and write anything about that?
I did learn a little bit about the Mimic Octopus, and he's certainly a very interesting guy, isn't he? To tell you the truth, being from the Midwest, I found him a little scary because he can look like snakes in the ocean. He can look like anything that he wants to, apparently. I didn't do a lot of writing about him, though, but I did find him really, really interesting. There's some great video on YouTube of watching him change all these different shapes and colors. How do they do that? You know, the interesting thing about these animals is they don't see in color. They see luminosity, but they don't see in color, and yet they can echo the colors that are around them. How do they do that? Where does that come from? Any other questions? Yeah?
What would I search for if I wanted to find that video of the octopus solving the puzzle?
Well, what you'll find, you won't find the video. You'll find photographs of the octopus inside, and then you'll find there's a news clip, a news video that made it around the world, which I think is...
I think it's MSN.
MSN, is that it? I think if you put in Truman the octopus, he'll come up.
Or octopus in a tight space. It's something really weird.
Octopus.
It took me a while to find it.
Octopus cubed, something
Yeah.
like that. And it's in there. It's fun to watch. Any other questions? Yeah?
About a year ago or so, I remember reading a story that was kind of interesting. Maybe you can shed some light on it. They said it was in a lab, or an octopus lab. Maybe it was squid, I'm not sure. And at night, apparently when they left the light on, you know this story, they came back the next day and the light was off. And this happened several times until they looked more closely at what happened, and the octopus had climbed out of the tank and squirted the light to get it to go out, and went back in the tank repeatedly.
It's very interesting. Octopuses are capable of doing all kinds of things like that, and they pulled some of these capers right here at the New England Aquarium. Wilson was showing me the octopus tank again today, and I was meeting their new octopus to whom I was introduced, and he was telling me that they have to be very careful in the tank to repair even the smallest holes in the tank, because this huge animal that looks so large and weighs 30 pounds or more can actually squeeze through this tiny, tiny little hole and get out the other side. Of course, the problem with them is they can get out the other side, but sometimes they don't know how to get back in, and so it's not very good. They dry out and they die. So there are wonderful stories about that at aquariums all around the place, and I think they're true. They're able to learn these kinds of things and to do these tricks that we find unimaginable.
We were diving in Indonesia and watched the octopus, and it's amazing how fast they can just get sucked into the sand. They just disappear.
Yes.
And they also have used their tentacles to close clamshells around them to hide.
Mm-hmm.
Or there was one we witnessed that was in a half a bottle, and he was obviously scared of us, and he was looking around. You could see him looking around, and he was looking for garbage. And he got some garbage, and he put it around him with a veil. Like, I'm not here.
I'm not here. You can't see me. Kind of like the 3-year-old. No, you can't see me. Yeah, yeah. Well, they are obviously capable of things that we find charming. Sometimes not so charming, but we often find them charming, and I think it's because they don't have bones. I think that's what interests us. I wanted to call my book "The Vertebrates Conceived," but the publisher told me that was too geeky. I love that title because we think because we have bones we're better than all the other things on the earth. But in fact, the octopus and all those animals, the cephalopods, they do quite well without bones. So perhaps it's us who are burdened with the bones and not them.
As a matter of fact, when we saw them walk, they had very stiff legs.
Yes.
And they were walking as stiff-legged. They were playing you could play a little cat game with them with, a little wire. And they
Yes, they do. And interestingly, the various of the 8 arms have specific functions. There are some legs that they will almost always walk on, and some legs that they will use as a kind of antenna. And you have to say almost always, because one of the things I learned when I was reading about these animals is there's always an exception to the rule. The only rule about cephalopods is that there really is no rule. But they do often use stereotypical arms for certain functions that, of course, in our brains we equate with human functions, walking and carrying things like that. Well, thank you guys all. Oh, one more question.
Did you do anything on the giant squid?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. This is a book that's a science book, cleverly disguised as a book about giant squid. So the first part of the book has a lot of giant squid information in it. And they actually do exist.